Questions? John Stone.
Hi, Dan. I really appreciated the presentation. I'm chums with Steve Rayner. I'm guessing you may know Steve, given the direction of your presentation. And I think I know the answer to this one. Actually, I have a couple of questions that all sort of bleed into each other. But I think that I know the answer to this is that, Steve talks about cultural theory, and Mary and Aaron talked of cultural theory, and you were talking about cultural cognition, which suggests that the emphasis is going to be on the individual. Now, I know that both Mary and Steve are adamant that cultural theory does not, it's about collectivities, not about individuals. And Steve actually described the grid group quadrants as a dance floor through which people may move freely depending on what sort of appeals they're making. And in that regard, that tends to bleed into a Boltanski and Taveno argument on worlds of justification. Through our project, I have a seat on the American National Standards Institute has a nanotechnology standards panel. And as you might expect, many of the startup companies that have very individualistic, market-based motivations for being there slip into a very communitarian, civic-minded kind of a justification when it comes to promulgating standards that suit their interests. We are one big happy family, right? And it's not about the the Western frontier kind of an approach. So I was just wondering if you've done any work in squaring kind of the collectivity, individual thing with the worlds of justifications.
Well, I mean, that's you're definitely identifying a part of the motivation for calling this cultural cognition. There is a methodological premise of this that I think a lot of orthodox cultural theorists would reject. In fact, any one of them who's orthodox would reject a kind of methodological individualism that any explanation you give of how phenomena that exist at a group level, something like worldview, influence behavior, has to be cashed out in terms of mechanisms that account for the behavior of individuals. The idea of cultural cognition is that we're going to connect the space between cultural worldviews and risk perceptions with mechanisms of that sort, ones that explain why individuals see things as they do and behave in ways that they imagine are in their interests. And so it's a kind of marriage, as it were, of Slovik's work and Mary Douglas's, although I think it would be a forced marriage. She wouldn't approve of it. And so we don't say it's the cultural theory of risk, in part to steer clear of some of those issues. Another point, though, and I think it's distinct, but it also would be methodologically very subversive of this kind of research, is the claim that you adverted to, that the cultural dispositions are context specific. And there is some writing in cultural theory that suggests that, although there's lots of writing that suggests otherwise. There's just lots of writing and lots of different interpretations of cultural theory. But the idea that the cultural dispositions are very domain specific, I think would make it impossible to treat cultural values as a predictive variable in this sort of work, because you would never know where it is you're supposed to be measuring somebody's cultural orientation, or just something that's basically methodologically not reliable. It changes, it's mutable. It can't be exerting force, at least at the level of generality that we're talking about here, although it might explain why people work one way in a workplace and so forth. The point about corporate culture, I apologize, I'm going on too long, but of course, Mary Douglas's work has lots of points of contact with work in other fields, and there is a great cross-cultural psychology, much of it which was subsidized by multinational corporations that wanted to know exactly what kind of corporate management style they should use in other countries and so forth. So, you know, a lot of this is known and put into practice in the market, not surprisingly.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kevin Elliott. I also really enjoyed your talk. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
And I have to confess, I'm a philosopher, not a social scientist, so bear with me with my question. But so say we acknowledge that this evidence provides some good reason to think that cultural cognition plays a significant role. Can you help me to get an understanding of, say, how powerful the role of these cultural cognition factors might be relative to other considerations? You know, we were hearing about trust issues and dread and those kinds of considerations. I don't have a good sense of sort of how to get a sense of how potent these factors might be relative to others.
So, well, there are two responses. I mean, the first, candidly, this kind of research is far too close to its inception to make it possible to say with confidence what the effect sizes are going to be with respect to any particular kind of risk or intervention. I mean, I think it's useful, and oftentimes, even in laboratory experiments like this, the general or the external validity of which is still to be worked out. You have suggestive ways to proceed in a world in which you have to act quickly. But I think that's all at this point that we have. And how do we can observe effects in the lab, but how, what exactly happens outside, I think is hard to say. And so more research is necessary. But if you believe, and I think there is good reason to believe that mechanisms of the sort you are describing, like dread and trust, have a big impact in the world, then one thing that this research helps you to see is that the way in which those things have their impact on the world is likely to be moderated by culture, that there's likely to be an interaction between those factors which we know are important and people's values. Yes, people have to trust risk communicators and regulators before they're willing to assent to the kind of information they're giving them. But what determines whether they trust them? Well, it turns out that a cultural affinity is likely to be part of that story and should be investigated and attended to. Of course, people treat dreaded risks as being more important than ones that are less dreaded, and wholly apart from the expected disutility of those risks. To harken back to the first session in this presentation. But what determines what kinds of risks provoke a dreaded affect in them? We've studied, for example, gun risk perceptions, and for people who are hierarchical and individualistic, the kind of risk that they dread is that they'll be rendered defenseless if they don't have a gun to protect themselves. They would never be able to live with themselves if they didn't have the gun ready to protect their family. The kind of dread, though, that the egalitarian and communitarian subject has towards guns is that if he has a gun, maybe somebody in his house will be injured by it, or somebody will use it, take it from him and injure another person, right? So affect is doing a tremendous amount of work in their risk perceptions, but one of the reasons you see individual differences is that affect is moderated by culture.
Thank you.
Yeah. Question from Dr. Martin Kohlberg again. If you follow the recommendation of using different experts of different cultural styles in discussing a position, how would you reduce the possibility of artificially creating an expert dissent? And if risk communication recipients hear different messages, how would that help in addressing or attenuating uncertainty?
Well, I think that clearly the possibility that, I mean, there's no connection between this technique and an outcome that's normatively desirable. I mean, that's just being kind of abstract about it. But sure, why wouldn't somebody who wanted to create dissensus also use this technique. Well, they do, right?